So you get to the New York Times eventually, and your vision has always been, journalism as activism. I think for some people, they think of that as like a very specific route. But to me, it seems like your point of view is that like that is journalism. Like it's not like this is the type of journalism I do. Like that is journalism as a craft.
Yes, absolutely. So one, again, to be clear, I'm a reporter. I report. My work is factually sound. I spent many years of my career as an investigative reporter. So I am in a position where I speak out. I do the type of work I do because I first built a career as a good reporter. Like I'm not just coming in, just spouting my opinion, right? Like I built a whole career out of that. But I also think journalists of color often get labeled, right, as being activists. But the question is very simple. If I cover Child Protective Services as just a beat reporter, and I expose, how Child Protective Services failed a family and a child died, I'm not just doing that reporting because I'm like, it would be cool if people knew this. I'm doing that because I want that agency to serve children well. I want people to be accountable to the public. That is activism. Now, it's not the activism that's like marching in the street at a Black Lives Matter protest. I'm not allowed to do that as a journalist, and I don't need to do that.
Speak to that. Why are you not allowed to do that?
Well, because we are not supposed to engage in that sort of activism, right? Our job is to report the news, not be a part of the news. We're the journalists who expose what happened to George Floyd. We're the people who provide the information that then leads people to act in the streets because they have the information about how these systems are failing us or what happened exactly when George Floyd died, right? That is our role. And that can be tricky because for many Black journalists and young Black journalists in particular, you got into journalism because you want to change your society.
Yeah.
And so trust me, it's very hard. I wanted to be in the streets. Of course I did. But I know that's not my role. That my role is to provide the reporting, to do the digging, to expose the malfeasance. And then you pass that baton to activists to use that information to take to the streets. And we have to work together. You just look at, for instance, the civil rights movement. One of my favorite books on journalism is called The Race Beat. And it really shows how everything that Dr. King, that Fred Shuttlesworth, that all of the civil rights activists were doing, until the media covered it, it didn't matter.
Right.
Those white politicians did not care. Black people had been living under Jim Crow. They had been being thrown into the river, lynched, killed. But once the media decided, oh, this is a story we're going to cover, we're going to expose what's happening, that's when we were able to bring about the change. So you really have to have both of those forces working together. And I understand my role is to do the digging and the exposing and to bear witness. And other people's roles are to be in the streets forcing politicians and others to change policy.
How do you feel about the way the greater journalistic spaces have covered the recent and current genocide on Palestine?
It's fascinating to me that the same profession that talks about independence, that talks about holding power accountable, was so timid in the coverage and really was reflecting a very particular worldview. Myself, along with many journalists, have been frustrated. And I think the place I have felt the most liberated to speak out on is just the silence around the number of journalists who've been killed.
Unbelievable.
More journalists killed covering what's happening there than any war that we know of.
Literally.
Like, period. There's a journalist right now in Russia who is being held by the Russian government. And you see ads in newspapers. You see all of these efforts to free him and to make sure that we keep talking about it and in solidarity. And instead, what our profession has largely done is treat with skepticism whether those journalists in Gaza being killed are really journalists.
Literally like, oh, well, they might be members of Hamas. Like seeing that was really what blew my mind in terms of the willingness to just that easily just give up the the ethical, nature of like journalism as a unit, because even like because I think for those of y'all who may not be like a part of like a certain professional, like as a comic, like there's like a camaraderie that we share as comics, like knowing that we're in the world in a certain way and that's going to garner a certain type of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And so like when you see other comics being attacked or harmed, or like we've seen, like during the pandemic, a lot of comics like weren't able to work. And so then people pooled money to help. Like that is something that is not easily just severed. So the ease with which that same connectivity within the journalism community was severed from the Gazan journalists was like, it really took me aback. And I didn't know. So that was, cause I'm like, is that something that, is there a journalist, group chat where y'all are like, what y'all doing?
I mean, yeah, my journalist group chat was Twitter, but, or X, but I don't call it X.
No, it's Twitter. His mama called him Clay. I'm gonna call him Clay. It's Twitter.
Right. Okay. What's so crazy about it though, Amanda, is Western, I don't even like using words like that, right? But journalists from the US, journalists from the UK weren't even allowed into Gaza to cover the conflict. So literally the only way to get, I mean, how many times did you see stand-ups from Tel Aviv that are telling you ostensibly what's happening in Gaza, but those journalists couldn't even get in there. And if they were, they had to be with IDF and they had to sign agreements that IDF would review everything before publication, which we don't journalistically, we're not supposed to do. And yet you have actual journalists who are from that community who are there covering it, who are dying, whose entire families are being killed. And we're not standing up collectively for them. I think that has also changed somewhat, but it's been shameful, frankly. And I also recognize that spirit that oftentimes Black journalists who work for community, Black news organizations who do community journalism are also discounted as not real journalists, right? Because you haven't been professionally trained, or it's like
you haven't been co-signed by a big white company.
Right. And so you would look at this extreme skepticism of reports coming from Gaza journalists, even if they were working for, a mainstream publication like Al Jazeera. Mm-hmm. And yet not that same type of skepticism from people who obviously are also reporting. Is a Gazan journalist biased towards Gazans? I would presume so, right? Like, yes.
Especially as a Gazan journalist who has seen other Gazan journalists like harmed. There's going to be a bias.
And do you see the conflict in a different way, right? You're not marking that conflict in October. You're marking that. I mean, this is the same thing that Black folks, right? It's like the George Floyd moment doesn't start at the George Floyd moment. But while we can recognize that a Gazan journalist is reporting with a bias, for sure, we don't recognize that the American journalists are reporting with a bias, that they're also not neutral arbiters of the truth, that they're also making decisions. I remember the first few weeks of the conflict, I was like, even when you're reporting on the death toll in Gaza, the only people you're interviewing are Israelis about what happened to them 3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And that story deserves to be told, but that's not the only story that deserves to be told. So I'm like, you'll be like, oh, 10,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Now let's go back to the kibbutz and talk about, what happened 3 weeks ago. Okay. But you also have to be there, like actually interviewing the living, dying people in the conflict area.
I did an Instagram live with Mansour from his tent in Gaza. So it's like, if we wanted to, we would. And
we find ways.
We find ways.
We find ways.
Are you invested in this? I am invested in this conversation. This is like one of them articles where you start to read it and you're like, I got to keep reading it because you need more. Well, if you want more, then let me tell you what to do. Go on over to my Patreon, Amanda Seales, or go to theamandaverse.com. Either route will get you where you need to be to see the full extent of this interview. Yes, come and join us at the Seal Squad.